Empire Space has conducted an extensive analysis of key space ecosystems throughout the United States and found that New York is lagging behind key players in the race to play a defining role in the 21st century space age. During our November 2020 town hall, we presented a detailed synopsis of our findings. We encourage you to read the entire report online.
The big one that we have been working on for most of the summer and through the fall was the state-by-state report. So we wanted to identify not only the leading states in the national space ecosystem, but understand what was driving, these systems on a deeper level. So we looked at industrial, academic, government, and infrastructure components for every state we identified. And the main question, the lens was, what is a healthy state space ecosystem and how do they function? So looking at these states kind of above us in these NASA rankings, how do they work? How do they thrive? How do they succeed? The inclusion was the location of either a major NASA facility or a significant spaceport project in the state. Most states could probably be run for some kind of analysis like this, but we picked what wound up to be the 17 largest. They're all listed for you right there. And the major takeaways, so we're not going to run you through the full 70-page report. I don't want everyone to fall asleep. So the major takeaways, the lessons to learn from that analysis, and I will run through these one by one. Interdependence and symbiotic relationships are critical. You have to have robust connectivity between every different sphere. Academic spheres have to feed into industrial. They have to be supported by a robust civic sector, and state government has to be involved. Emphasize and build up hubs, having those key nodes, those places where sectors can mingle, where innovation can happen, experience can be shared, is critically important. Don't ignore civic society. In some of the most robust space ecosystems we studied, there was a very vibrant nonprofit and kind of community sector. They often will facilitate that interdependence. They'll hold forums, they'll hold events, to bring people together from industry and government and academia. They'll foster grant programs and other things like that. So very often the civic groups are the glue that kind of fosters that interdependence. Fourth, consult the community. Be aware, angry neighbors. Oftentimes we would find examples in these states. People would go to kind of grow and expand. They propose these big projects. They wouldn't talk to anyone who lived next door to it, and they would wound up making a lot of people very angry, which very often proved fatal. So when you are thinking of expansive growth in the space sector, just be sure to consult with the people who live next door. Space need not be partisan. In most of these states, as space and aerospace kind of went up the issue profile, it did not become correspondingly partisan. In most places, it was passed off between governors of different parties who would support the same projects. Legislators recognized the importance of it and the economic benefit of it, and it did not become an intense partisan football. State government support is likely determinative in the sense that you can have state government support and not wind up with a healthy space ecosystem, but it is probably impossible to have a healthy space ecosystem without state government support. It's just so necessary in terms of bureaucratic assistance and moving things forward, funding, regulation, X, Y, and Z. They can also serve to foster some of that interdependence. So having state government in support of a space sector is critical. Spaceports are evolving. For a long time in American history, spaceports, it was Cape Canaveral. Maybe you had Vandenberg out in California, which was a military base. Large, heavy lift facilities or space shuttle landing, ports. In the last 10 or 15 years, that has changed tremendously. There are a number of states who are pursuing a number of different spaceport projects, horizontal, vertical, hybrid, some with, commercial airlines, some are effectively business parks. Again, to go to the most successful ones, we look at, Houston, which is an urban spaceport. They have a campus from a local community college. They're bringing industry together. It has strong support from state government. So that evolution has been something interesting to track. Space projects have a long lead time in the sense that things do not happen quick in space and aerospace. So you have to have that patience and that foresight and that kind of moderation, acknowledging that things don't happen like that. Diversification of major projects dramatically increases their viability. This is probably true for most large projects, but particularly in space, if you have that cross-sector and multiple stakeholders from each sector involved in a project, it's much more likely to thrive, much more likely to receive support, much more likely to last that long lead time. Next, focusing on the academic pipeline, the healthiest space ecosystems not only college programs, but they have K through 12 connections that feed into the college programs that are amplified by connections from the nonprofit sector, because that's what industry needs to thrive. So states that have focused on that are the ones that will often succeed. The economic payoffs can be big. States that have an active and growing space and aerospace sector, tremendous payoffs, tax benefits, job creation. These are usually very well-paying jobs. There are secondary impacts on all sorts of other fields, materials manufacturing, X, Y, and Z. So the ripple effects from a growing space ecosystem are substantive. Next, deliver or people will lose interest. It kind of goes to the long lead time. Very often we would find this arc. People would introduce projects. It would be all this fanfare. We're going to do all these amazing things. And then 2 years later, nothing would have happened. And everyone has moved away. And credibility's gone and no one's interested anymore. And it's impossible to kind of recreate that either excitement from the community or that interest from legislators. Because once they've been burned, they're much less likely to come back to you another time around. Final lesson, federal government champions can unlock lots of doors. Richard Selby was a Republican from Alabama. Barbara Mikulski was a Democrat from Maryland. They almost single-handedly kind of carried the torch and kept Alabama and Maryland as major space ecosystems. The fact that they're 4th and 5th on that list is in no small part to them, just because they were able to advocate for their state, bring in research, attention, networking, the whole thing. So federal champions can be important. So I know that's a lot of takeaways, but it was a long report, and we thought these lessons were all relevant moving forward. So bringing these lessons down to specifically New York, 5 main takeaways. Our state government support is sorely lacking. We've alluded to this in previous reports. I cracked a joke about it earlier tonight. Every single one of these states has either a statewide commission or activity from legislators far and above what is occurring in New York. There is no kind of holistic or organized government incentive to study or amplify the space sector here. It really does pale in comparison to what's happening in almost every single state that we studied. Levels of interconnectedness and mutual reinforcement are lacking. Evan had kind of alluded to this earlier. We have lots of great work going on, but oftentimes the different sectors will not talk to each other. Stakeholders within sectors won't talk to each other. And very often New York suffers from that regional dilemma. Companies in the city don't talk to companies upstate, X, Y, and Z. So focusing on those cross-sector and those multi-regional collaborations to kind of amplify and get the most out of what we already have going on here is important. Third, we have the major universities and civic infrastructure of other states. That is not an area that New York is lacking in. Columbia and Cornell, I know we harp on them all the time. There are dozens of other colleges and universities in our census database. There are lots of great civic groups in the state. So we have those resources. We just need to better connect them to everything else that's going on in the state. We had the industry footprint. It has atrophied over time. I'm a Rochesterian, so our story here is shaped by Kodak. A couple years before I was born, Kodak employed 80,000 people in Rochester. Now it employs 3,000. And that kind of similar arc over the last 40 plus years is what happened to the aerospace sector. It's still large. We still see that in the graphs earlier, aerospace manufacturing consuming more than half of the categories we identified, the huge emphasis on Long Island. So we still have the footprint. It's just not what it once was. And because it lacks the connections to, the academic sphere, to the civic sphere, and now to the state government, there's no more lobbying effort. It's continued to atrophy. We do want to point out the Micron investment in Syracuse. It's $100 billion to build semiconductors in Syracuse. We are getting to the point where the narrative that advanced manufacturing can't happen in New York is almost dead. While it's not directly a space relevant investment, we think it does correlate in challenging that narrative that you can't do this kind of heavy manufacturing here, that it's too expensive, XYZ. Well, they just invested $100 billion to build semiconductors in Syracuse. So maybe that argument doesn't hold the water that it did 10 or 15 years ago. And then finally, large dynamic space projects like a spaceport or other major investments, business hub, space incubator, all of that could be possible here if we make these connections. We're 15th, we're not 35th. We're a space finance hub. We have these colleges and these universities. We have the legacy. We have the footprint there. If we can tie everything together, it is very reasonable to expect that New York could become a much larger destination and a much larger contributor to the nationwide space ecosystem. So future areas to investigate, we would like to establish a standard set of metrics for each state that can be tracked over time, particularly in economic and academic categories. That would speak more to the benchmarks we want to establish for New York. We can only really know how well we're growing if we know how well our peers are growing. So establishing those kind of definite trackable metrics is something that we want to do. We also want to explore the variances across states in regards to efforts for diversity and access in the space industry. It wasn't something that came up much throughout our research. We think that should be a greater area of focus, so we would hope to spin that up into a separate report to look nationwide at what is going on at different colleges and universities to kind of correct the long-standing barriers to access and inclusion that we know exist in the space and aerospace industry. We would also like to conduct more extensive research and state-specific interviews now that we've conducted these analyses, run them through a number of feedback mechanisms from these different states. What do they think? Do they have additional insights, connections that we can learn from? Other states to include could potentially be Arizona, Utah, Massachusetts, Nevada, Illinois, and New Jersey. Those were some of the other states kind of around us or just behind us in the NASA rankings. So that is the long and short of the state-by-state report.
Thank you for watching. To read the full state-by-state report, please visit empirespace.org/reports. Have a great day.